Namaste, Namaste, welcome to the 7th episode of Caste Conversation. I'm Pradip Pariyar. Caste Conversation is a dialogue to understand the caste dynamics that affect our society, our lives, and our value system. Caste Conversation is an initiative of Dalit Life Matters Nepal to ignite solution-oriented dialogue for the elimination of caste-based discrimination and untouchability. Dalit Life Matters. Dalit Live Matter Nepal. Welcome to the 7th episode of Caste Conversation. I'm Pradip Pariyar. Caste Conversation is a dialogue to... So welcome to all of you in 7th episode of Caste Conversation. Dalit Live Matter Nepal is a social movement to create a just society where every Nepali can enjoy life without the fear of being persecuted in the name of caste. It is an initiative to counter and fight back all form of caste-based discrimination and untouchability, a collective intervention to ensure every right of every single Nepali citizen is guaranteed in the Constitution of Nepal. Dalit Life Matter Nepal is a connection with people to build a collective force and amplify people's power to eradicate any inequality, discrimination, and violence based on the caste system. In today's episode of Caste Conversation, we have a Professor Laurence Simon as the guest speaker. Professor Simon is a well-known professor of international development and the director of the Center for Global Development and Sustainability at Brandeis University. Also, he served as the joint editor-in-chief of Caste Journal, a global journal on social inclusion published under the auspices of the Brandeis Library. Professor Simon's research and teaching focuses on critical issues of social exclusion and emancipatory development. Professor Laurence, welcome to Caste Conversation.
Thank you very much, Pradip. It's an honor to be with you.
It's a really honor from our side. I had a wonderful opportunity to meet Professor Laurence in New York last September during the 5th International Conference on Unfinished Legacy of Dr. Bhimrao Ambedkar. Thank you for joining Professor Simon. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Let me begin with the first question. And my first question to you is, Brandeis University is one of the first higher education institutions to ban caste-based discrimination outright. Given this, I would like asked Professor Simon, how and why did the university decided to bring non-discriminatory policy based on caste, and what was the impact after the enactment of the policies?
Thank you very much, Pradip. I'd also, I'd also like to thank everyone else on your coordinating team for organizing the series. I've listened to several of the previous webinars and find them really extraordinarily important, not only in the context of Nepal, and of South Asia, but in the United States also, where caste is, in the United States, as I think you know, caste is the hidden discrimination. Unless one comes from the South Asian community, most Americans do not know about caste in South Asia. They have to be, we need to raise a lot of consciousness in the United States. So to answer your question, Pradip, I'd like to begin by trying to put that question of how Brandeis came to this, okay? Excuse me, in a somewhat broader context about the history of social movements and how Brandeis perhaps plays a modest role in that, particularly with the issues of caste discrimination. So let me begin then by talking about the long histories that oppression has in any part of the world. You know, we've all seen the protests on, I'm sure, our TVs of the protests in the United States that were sparked by the murder of George Floyd. But all processes of oppression and marginalization have long histories. In fact, I would go on to say that Mr. Floyd's oppression began long before he was born. It began probably around 400 years ago in 1619, when the first slave ship arriving in the British colony of Virginia, and thus began 250 years of slavery. At the end of the Civil War, where blacks, which was fought to end slavery, there was a short period of what we call Reconstruction, where blacks made significant progress during what was essentially a Union occupation of former slave states. But then the white population of the South succeeded in taking back control and passed laws that euphemistically we call Jim Crow laws. And they basically crippled the promise of democracy for free slaves. So the legacy of slavery is still palpable in the poverty and oppression of our African American brothers and sisters. Despite the economic progress that blacks have made in the past decades, with many entering the middle class even, some factors still perpetuate their oppression. You know, almost the final words that George Floyd said of, "I can't breathe," these words have become the rallying cry not only to end police brutality, but to end racism that is embedded in the bias known as white privilege. That is not to say, of course, that all people of European ancestry are racist, but all peoples of any ethnicity and culture see through certain lenses, certain biases that many are even unaware of. And biases reinforced often in our houses of worship, in the way history is taught in our schools, in our national and religious holidays, in who we marry sometimes, and who, for some of us, who we hang out with even. The equivalent of white privilege is found in the very roots of caste. The English word, as I think your audience knows, the English word caste derives from the Latin castus, denoting being cut off or separated. And the Portuguese word casta carried that further into purity of lineage, purity of race or breed, thus separating the colonial Portuguese from the indigenous and mixed races of their colony in Brazil. The concept of purity can poison cultures and create what the American psychologist Erik Erikson once called pseudospeciation, which he described as one people considering another so inferior that they have become, in the eyes of the oppressor, distinct and even subpar species. We only have to think of the European attitudes toward Native Americans, or the exploitation of the African slave, or blacks in apartheid states of Africa, or the Jews of Imperial Russia, my own ancestors, who were confined to the Pale of Settlement, limited to Jewish quotas for education, and suffering the collective violence of what were called pogroms against their communities. We know that Western history is littered with such dehumanization, and their legacies are still palpable in contemporary societies. Asia was the cradle of some of the world's major faiths, yet today, in the name of those religions, pogroms are led against religious outsiders in Sri Lanka and Myanmar, for instance, and in India. This tragedy of a moral and spiritual corruption has sustained the oldest form of prejudice in the world today, the division of society into rigid, birth-based, graded hierarchy of caste. While progress towards social equality has surely been made, the birth-based caste system has survived millennia and continues to hinder the lives of millions of low caste and tribal citizens. It remains a leading cause of horrendous acts of violence, such as we have seen in Nepal recently, including gang rape and lynching in India, honor killings for intercaste romances. It results in suicides on Indian campuses, bias in employment and housing, and a staggering waste of human potential. Despite reformist movements and affirmative action policies, and even after legal protections, the stigma of untouchability and affirmative action policies, and even after, still exists in a culture derived from ancient scriptures. So then for me, the question is, how then do we counter the dominance of these deeply embedded beliefs, these mythologies of superiority? We need to do so, of course, within each of our societies and build coalitions with other communities of marginalization around the world. In this, I applaud the work, for instance, of Paul Divakar, who helps to build networks and global partnerships and joint actions in addressing discrimination based on work, descent, and caste systems around the world. We need to convene international meetings on marginalization, such as the now 5 international conferences begun at Brandeis on, as you mentioned, Pradip, the unfinished legacy of Dr. B.R. Ambedkar. And we need national governments to raise these issues in bilateral and multilateral meetings. But we need strategic interventions in our own key institutions in each of our countries. So let me then address, at least superficially given our time constraints today, 3 domains of influence. One is, I'm going to talk about higher education, particularly in the United States. So I speak about the US, and you can fill in your own experience, of course, in Nepal and in other countries. As many of you know, and as you, Pradip, mentioned a few moments ago, Professor Sukhatio Thorat and I founded an academic journal called Caste, a global journal on social exclusion. This came about in part when I noticed that many South Asian studies programs in the United States did not have courses that highlighted caste, even in syllabi, on courses on religions of India, courses on political histories, or on South Asian cultures. One member of our editorial advisory board from the journal, the renowned philosopher Martha Nussbaum, once wrote about her own experience many years ago studying the classics and literature at Harvard University. She wrote that women were just not represented in the canon, and that a young woman studying literature could come to believe that if women were absent in the curriculum, then women don't count. I would say, with respect to South Asian studies programs in the United States, that if Dalits are absent in the syllabus, they don't count. It's not an oversight, it's a willful editing of history, a justification for one's own privilege, no matter how propagated by one's own religion or religious culture. In truth, however, they are silenced, and Brahmin privilege is ever as powerful and sometimes subtle as white privilege. Building a network across America of engaged scholars of caste is one of the objectives of our journal. Another way we have raised the issue of caste in American higher education was right on our own campus at Brandeis University. Brandeis was the ideal starting point. Brandeis was founded in 1948 as a model of ethnic and religious pluralism. Though we are a non-sectarian university, our founders were prominent Jews, including people like Albert Einstein, who disliked the quota system at Ivy League schools that admitted Jews or anyone who was not white, Anglo-Saxon, and Protestant only in small numbers. By welcoming students, faculty, and staff of every nationality, religion, and orientation, Brandeis rose to national prominence and contributed to the demise of the quota system of the Ivy League. In 1985, Brandeis was elected to the Association of American Universities, an invitation-only group representing the 63 leading research universities in the US and Canada. Like all other universities, our non-discrimination policies incorporated legally protected categories of race and gender and so on. But caste is not a protected category under state or federal law. We raised this issue of caste on campus, and the administration formed a task force, which I co-chaired with our Vice President for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. The majority of our task force members, in fact, were faculty, students, and staff of South Asian backgrounds. Our task was to tactfully and confidentially survey our university community to determine if caste identities led to any experience of discrimination. In short, we did not find any allegations of discrimination by the administration or by faculty, but we received significant testimony of caste discrimination amongst students from South Asia. This was felt by low caste or Dalit students. Our inquiry lasted almost a year and resulted in the university including caste in our non-discrimination policies. We believe we are the first in the US to do so. You know, universities are enormously influential in much of the world, and their teachings through their curricula, as well as in their campus policies, expand or constrain the reasoning and reflections of future generations. You know, the US had over 1 million foreign students at our universities last year. They should take this message about caste discrimination home to all corners of the world. So if you permit me to just address quickly 2 other domains where I think influence is very important for us. The second one then I'll refer to is about faith communities. You know, world religions have played an important role historically, both in oppression and in liberation. The Peruvian Catholic theologian, Father Gustavo Gutierrez, who is often called the father of liberation theology, says, and I quote from Father Gutierrez, "The denunciation of injustice implies the rejection of the use of Christianity to legitimize the established order." So we on this webinar might ask if the denunciation of injustice in Nepal and India and elsewhere implies the rejection of the use of Hinduism to legitimize the established order. And again, Father Gutierrez says, and I quote, "But the poor person does not exist as an inescapable fact of destiny. His or her existence is not politically neutral, and it is not ethically innocent. The poor are a byproduct of the system in which we live and for which we are responsible. They are marginalized by our social and cultural world. They are the oppressed, exploited proletariat, robbed of the fruit of their labor and despoiled of their humanity. Hence, the poverty of the poor is not a call to generous relief action," he says, "but a demand that we go and build a different social order." And I would comment that I'm sure Father Gutierrez would apply the same reasoning to those oppressed by caste and who labor in the sewers and whose children still in some schools sit segregated from others. Many religious institutions have gone through reformations. I'll give you an example. The Dutch Reformed Church of South Africa, the major church of the Afrikaner people, taught for many years the biblical justification of racial apartheid. As the anti-apartheid movement gained strength, it prompted their religious leaders to look inward, to search their souls and their understanding of their God. And they issued a deeply reflective apology and embraced the liberation of all South Africans. We might consider in this webinar whether that can happen in India or other nations. Dr. Ambedkar wrote in the prologue of Annihilation of Caste that, and I quote, "It is not possible to break caste without annihilating the religious notions on which the caste system, is founded." This is the stark contrast with the theology liberation that aimed to bring theological teachings back to its origins with Jesus, and whose current pope, in fact, is a product of that experience from his native Argentina. Thousands of years of oppression of a birth-based social hierarchy has so deeply embedded itself in religious culture that it has today bred a social movement of Dalit assertion that insists not only on their constitutional rights, but on the radical transformation of human relationships toward a new ethical culture of equality, not only in law, but in everyday life. That is the struggle unfolding, I believe, in India, and I believe in Nepal, and indeed in other cultures throughout the world. You know, my own mentor in my young days, my early career, was the Brazilian social theorist Paulo Freire. And Freire saw the vocation of humanization of everyday life as epoch changing. For Ambedkar, it was an act of conversion to Buddhism, an act that said that if his faith did not permit a path to liberation for his people, then he would stop believing in that faith. This was heresy, of course, to some. It was an act of liberation to others. In other words, freedom means the power of critical consciousness to reject a state of mind that you have grown up with. But we need to be careful, for Hinduism is surely one of the great world religions and rich in meaning. Like other world religions, its future relevance for younger generations may depend on the possibility of reformation, of rejecting the very notion of caste, not just softening the sharp edge of discrimination, but rejecting outright the inferiority of any child born into its traditions. And finally, for today then, a brief mention of influence on corporate employment practices, because I think it's the third major area of influence that we need to have. Some of us in the States have studied caste in America. Philip Martin, who is one of America's finest investigative reporters, did a 5-part series on caste in America through one of our national public radio stations, WGBH in Boston. And you can find the series by just Googling Caste in America. And recently, what may prove to be a landmark legal case was initiated by the Fair Employment and Housing Department of the state of California, which has sued Cisco Systems, Inc., and 2 of its employees on behalf of an Indian engineer of Dalit background, who alleges that because of caste prejudice, he was paid less, given fewer opportunities, and inferior workplace conditions. Bloomberg Law reports that California alleges that his supervisors and co-workers were beneficiaries of the caste system and therefore imported this form of bias to Cisco and the US at large. If successful, the case will be an important precedent that helps to establish caste as a distinct form of discrimination that is not adequately captured by or under current protected categories. So in summary, there's a great struggle unfolding in South Asia and indeed in other cultures throughout the world, including America. Again, quoting my mentor, Paulo Freire, who wrote in Pedagogy of the Oppressed, said, "The oppressors who oppress, exploit, and rape by virtue of their power cannot find in this power the strength to liberate either the oppressed or themselves. Only power," he wrote, "that springs from the weakness of the oppressed will be sufficiently strong to free both." That's a curious expression, but I think again at George Floyd's last words, and think about this, what Freire has just said many years ago, that only power that springs from the weakness of the oppressed will be sufficiently strong to free both. I think he meant that only power that springs from weakness can be self-reflective and learn to question the fixed reality that envelops all of us. And no matter how wrenching it is to leave the familiar, we need to enter a world of possibility that finally disperses the social illusion that has dulled our minds and for many poisoned our souls. So thank you, Pradip. I've gone a little bit further than the confines of your initial question, but I do look forward to our conversation.
Yeah, I can feel that. That's professor always goes longer. I know about that. So,
that's an occupational hazard. You're correct.
I know. So rightly you mentioned, you talk about the white privilege. Usually we don't talk about our own privilege. Could you please elaborate on this more, white privilege?
Well, let me put it this way. My skin is white, right? My family, on both sides of my family, my mother's side, my father's side, came around to the United States in 1900, long after slavery was abolished, right? They came to New York to try to make a living. They were very poor people. So I could argue, which I won't, but I could argue that I don't feel any white privilege because we came from poverty. We came to the United States long after slavery, but that's not really an accurate understanding of what happened to our family here. In one generation, through very hard work and through a devotion to learning, all of my aunts and uncles, my father was the firstborn in his family here in the United States, all my aunts and uncles entered the middle class. They became and dentists and other things. We did inherit in this society that was tough to get through in the early years, I'm sure for both my parents as children. We still inherited certain privileges because of the color of our skin, which other people, even around 1900, not only in the southern US, which was still part of the Jim Crow laws, but even in the northern states, still suffered from this kind of historical discrimination, not only based on slavery, but even other people of color coming to the United States, a deeply embedded racism. And so it doesn't take much, I think, Pradip, for white people to feel like I'm not responsible for that. I have a black friend or whatever else people might say, because we live in a society where our institutions have had deeply embedded racist attitudes. Some not always the overt kind of going out that the old Ku Klux Klan used to do and lynch people in the southern states, but still kind of a pass if you have a certain skin color. As I mentioned, Pradip, also in the Ivy League schools before Brandeis was founded, if you weren't white Anglo-Saxon Protestant, you didn't even get into the Ivy League schools except in small quarters and small numbers. This wasn't a reservation system like you have in India, saying it wasn't an affirmative action system like we have in the United States. It was a strict quota. You hit the quota, and that was the end of the admission for your group until the next year. So yeah, it's white privilege. It used to be more than white privilege. It used to be white Anglo-Saxon Protestant privilege. But it is something that still very much exists in the United States.
Yeah, great. So you have been quoted in one of the recent articles that caste is really the hidden discrimination in the United States. And these days in our society also, especially in the cities, that's hidden discrimination. Why do we say so, and how can we end this malpractice?
Well, I call it the hidden discrimination because most Americans, unless they come from South Asian cultures, whether they are immigrants or come here on work visas, like many people in high tech are from South Asia, most other Americans have no understanding, no concept of what caste is. And when you explain it to them, I think most Americans think that it's rather abhorrent to discriminate against somebody merely because they were born into a particular family. This accident of birth, to our mind, is completely irrational. That being said, it's a influence in South Asian, among some South Asians, especially I think those who come to the United States, as I say, in work visas or immigrant visas. I think it begins to fade over 2-3 generations of growing up in America. People become more Americanized, both with an ethical view that is different maybe from the old world. And that applies to many traditions that immigrants from all over the world and many cultures generally are determined in many ways by the traditions that they bring with them. But the next generations begin to liberalize and have more of a universalist view. But it is still powerful. But it is a hidden discrimination because most Americans have no knowledge of this. And I think that's why it's not it's not embedded in either state or federal laws against discrimination, but I believe we will get there eventually.
Before we enter into the question and answer round, I know you have a Nepal connection. I know you are also associated and connected to Nepal. Would you like to share your Nepal experience if you have any?
Well, I'm sure, I'm glad you said any, Pradip, because I have never set foot in Nepal. And through, I believe, one of our colleagues on this webinar, Dr. Purna Nepali, who was, along with another person from Nepal, Dr. Man, they had both been visiting scholars under the Fulbright program at my research center at the Hella School at Brandeis University. Dr. Nepali has invited me to come to work with the University of Kathmandu on curriculum issues. And I'm looking forward to that. Unfortunately, the pandemic has obviously delayed that along who knows how long before it's safe to travel again. So I am looking forward to coming to Nepal and a much longer future working with people there. But that being said, of course, I have many friends from Nepal, many colleagues such as you and Samata Pariyar and others with whom we already, of course, work on these issues of caste.
Great, great. We love to welcome you in Nepal, Kathmandu very soon. Hopefully COVID will go soon. So we have a question from West Bengal, India. Sapana Bagdas asks, why South Asian countries, especially India and Nepal, have not been able to raise concern and movements on Dalit Lives Matter as compared to Black Lives Matter, while both support Black Lives Matter but fail to show similar concern for Dalits? Dalit oppression is normalized, routinized, and ignored. How do you address these issues? How do you respond?
That's a really important question, and I'm not sure I have anything as that would be an adequate answer to it. I do know, I've been in and out of India for many years, actually for probably 40 years. And I have seen myself, in fact, the very first work that I did in India decades ago through an organization that I had founded called the American Jewish World Service was, in fact, helping to fund empowerment programs for Dalit youth. That was a small effort, obviously, compared to the enormous challenge of overcoming Dalit and Dalit oppression and other low caste and tribal oppressions. That being said, I have seen, of course, the rise of Dalit assertion movement in India, and you and others are far better to talk about it in Nepal than I am. But I think Dalit Lives Matter in Nepal is an example of this social movement, which is no longer hidden. It's out in the open. People are organizing around it. Why is it seem to the person asking the question perhaps as less effective or less widely known as Black Lives Matter? Well, again, Black Lives Matter didn't just spring up in the last, right after the murder of George Floyd. It had its origins again 400 years ago in the first slave ship arriving, right? So the history of oppression, and along with the history of oppression, the history of the abolition movement in the United States is hundreds of years old. It takes a long time, and sometimes, sadly, it takes the kinds of tragedy along with modern communications of modern video, people on the street being able to videotape what they see as a police brutality in the United States, that has finally coalesced, not only in the Black community, which has long been there, but in the white community, in the Hispanic community, even in the Asian American community, out on the streets of America, protesting against what they say is finally enough. This cannot go on. And it isn't just about police brutality. in the United States, and perhaps this is one of the great lessons for social movements around the world, that Black Lives Matter is really now a coalition of people of many races and goes far beyond the one incident or the many incidents of police brutality, but the one incident of the murder of George Floyd. So that now all universities, including my own, are going through soul searching about how do we think about even racisms that might be embedded in our own universities. Corporations are going through the same soul searching. We're seeing this on a scale in the United States, certainly not unknown to me during my lifetime.
Yeah, we have more questions.
Yes.
There's a nearby Brandeis. There's a question from Meg Colonial. She asks, do you think there are any parallel to be drawn in the appropriation of cultural symbols by white people or those of higher caste in the name of inclusion, celebration of national diversity? For example, white appropriation of traditionally Black form of music between the US and Nepal or India. So it's
Right.
nearby you, actually.
Right. So this is by no means an area of my expertise. My research center does work in the state of Mississippi, which is in the southern part of the U.S., as many of our guests know, and is a very poor state still, and particularly in the Mississippi Delta, which was the epicenter of slavery and of Black oppression. The situation, and in the Mississippi Delta, the tremendous contribution to American culture of the blues, and then as African Americans, as freed after the Civil War, some years later began the Great Migration in the North to find jobs in Chicago and elsewhere. They brought music with them. So honestly, most of the roots of what around the world we think of as American culture, music particularly, is actually African American, through the blues, through jazz, and so on. Yes, it was certainly during the days of even a more overt discrimination against African Americans. There were radio stations that didn't want to play black musicians, but they liked the music, and their listeners liked the music. So then you had the rise of people like Elvis Presley, frankly. And even the Beatles themselves attribute much of their style to Black music in the United States. So is that an appropriation of Black culture? Yes, in some respects. Is it a celebration of Black culture? Well, it depends, I think, really on who's performing it and how broadly they understand the roots of the music itself. It is true, of course, that many companies, even in the United States, have exploited African American culture for profit, and not for the benefit of African Americans. And I think that this continues to be a problem here. I don't know the equivalent areas of discussion in South Asia, though.
There is a more question from our fellow participant. In terms of severity, magnitude of discrimination, which is more critical between racial discrimination or caste-based discrimination? One of the friend, Ram Nepali, asked these questions. What do you think about this?
I'm sorry, which is more damaging, racial?
No, racial discrimination and between
Right.
caste-based discrimination.
Well, I think both of them have similar roots in many respects. I mean, the reason why caste is not incorporated into state or federal law is because, as I said before, it's largely unknown in American society. But more to the point, when we were incorporating caste at Brandeis into our non-discrimination policy, even though it didn't reflect federal or state law, we felt that it overlapped with some of the federal protections. So, for instance, federal law protects against discrimination against ancestry. Okay, discrimination against somebody from a particular background, that's called ancestry. In some respects, caste does overlap, but it doesn't really capture the nature of caste, which is why the state of California filed this lawsuit, not just on the basis of discrimination against what we call Title VII, which protects certain categories of people, but they felt that they had to file a lawsuit based on caste discrimination, because caste is not really captured adequately, defined adequately under all of these other protected categories, and needs to be presented as its own. So whether racial discrimination or caste discrimination, I think, which is more potent, which is more damaging, probably depends on which community you come from. They are both poisons in society.
So one of the things in this conversation, we are trying to think in how can we globalize these caste issues. One of the important questions around our mind, how can we do that?
Well, I think we have to work at several levels simultaneously. And of course, some of us need to work just within our own communities. Other people may have connections or influence or interest in working at much higher levels, at the state level in the United States, at the federal level in the United States, or its equivalents in other countries. Some people can work because of their backgrounds and their expertise at a level of at the international governmental level, because these issues that need to be raised in the United Nations, and I don't think the UN, despite efforts that some organizations have made, I don't think the UN as a whole has embraced it as either a form of racism or another form of discrimination, and they need to do that. So now, how do we do all of that? Well, I think, again, policy work, lobbying work needs to be done. But as I also mentioned in my introductory comments, Pradip, I think we need to work within our own spheres of influence. That is, within our own faith traditions, within our own community organizations. We need to work within our own institutions of learning, whether one's children are in primary school, secondary school, or in higher education. When they get to the age when they're studying in social studies, or they're studying political histories, or they're studying great cultures of the world, caste is largely absent and needs to be addressed in an age-appropriate way, of course, for children, but needs to be in there. The school systems need to understand that by leaving discussions of, let's say, Dr. Ambedkar out of a course on, let's say, 20th century political history of India is not just it's not just an omission, it's neglect.
Yeah, great. How this existing discrimination will last? What do you think about this? And their forms are changing, but is still existing. Whether it requires active action or it will end with time lapses. There's a question from Subhas Paudel. What do you think about this?
Well, the history of racism in the United States has lasted for hundreds of years, right? The history of casteism, of discrimination against what used to be called untouchables or other low caste peoples and tribals in India and perhaps elsewhere, has lasted more than a few hundred years. It's lasted thousands of years. Yes, modernity is a good thing in the sense that people become more and more worldly. They begin to realize that they are also citizens of the world, that many of us believe in universal human rights, not just very particular rights associated with one culture or another. So yes, I think over time, these discriminations will begin to fade. But I think it does require more action. It requires those people of goodwill and of knowledge to be catalysts for change. And that doesn't mean we always have to be out in the streets, although I am a very strong supporter of the protest movement that we see in the United States today. At times we need to be on the streets. Other times we need to be working on these issues in our own communities, as I've mentioned, and for those who have the wherewithal to work at international levels, to be sure that these are part of the discussion of global human rights. Will it last? I think these discriminations will last. You know, Dr. Ambedkar felt that ultimately caste will fade in India through intercaste marriages, through succeeding generations, right? I don't know if that's much of a trend, though I'm sure there are more and more intercaste marriages, of course. Again, perhaps the experience of, let's say, people from India and even high caste people from India coming and settling in the United States and becoming United States citizens, the experience, at least in my own life, the experience of the second and third generations born in the United States of Indian parents have a very different worldview than the parents brought with them from, at least many of the parents brought with them from India. So, you know, there are many Indian immigrants to the United States, and one couple are interviewed on Caste in America by the WGBH 5-part series about Indian immigrants who fled India because they had there was an intercaste marriage. And particularly years ago, there was such deep discrimination even within their own families toward them. So they left. I think over time, all these discriminations will fade, but it takes a long time, and without action on our part, it will be perpetuated.
Actually, we're seeking the justice and elimination of the caste-based discrimination in our generation. We need to take more action, I think. So one of our friends, Sunaina Arya from India, New Delhi, she asks, as a South Asian Dalit woman, I'm curious to learn from you on, if may I, how can we understand Latinx color issues in its similarities and differences with the Black race issues? How strong is Latinx movement as compared to Dalit and Black Lives movement? Maybe you know her.
Well, thank you, and Sunaina, thank you. I know Sunaina quite well. She's very active with our journal on caste, and is co-editing the next issue with Professor Ashok Gurung of the New School. Sunaina, that you ask me a really difficult question because I don't have all the knowledge necessary to talk about Latinx and so forth. However, I will say that yes, I think America has been plagued by many kinds of discriminations over many years. Again, when my grandparents came from Russia to flee deep discrimination, the tremendous violence of against Jews in Tsarist Russia, and in fact continues in some respects today. They found a very deeply embedded anti-Semitism in the United States, which has been largely abated. But we still found that the white supremacists that marched in the South, when was it, last year or a little bit longer than that, shouting, blacks will not replace us. They also shouted, Jews will not replace us. So these discriminations go on. All people of color have experienced some levels of discrimination in the United States, particularly Latin people who call themselves Latinx, and the intersectionality with gender, of course, is very powerful, kind of double discrimination, and some discrimination. If you're let's say a Dalit woman from India, being Dalit woman and a person of color, of course, in the United States. That being said, discrimination sometimes is not just something that is purely a basis of white privilege, right? We find that minorities in the United States sometimes discriminate or have discriminatory attitudes toward each other even. So I mean, this kind of poison can creep into many communal affairs. That being said, the power of the Black Lives Movement, I think today, especially in its manifestation after George Floyd's murder, was that many of these groups began to understand that they needed to work together, that Black Lives Matter is about Black people, but it also is powerfully relevant to help end discrimination against all peoples, which is why I think when you look at the TV images of these protests, you see people of all skin colors, if you knew who they were, they'd be people of all national origins. They are people who have come out to the street to say, yes, Black Lives Matter. Now, this might play out a little bit differently in Nepal with Dalit Lives Matter, of course. It is part of the same global movement, in my view, to rise above our specific cultural backgrounds, to say that in some respects all lives matter. Though in the United States, the focus must continue to be on Black Lives Matter as the banner for not only protection of African Americans against police brutality and embedded racism in institutions, but it also has to be the call for all people of goodwill to look inward and to say that their cultures also matter, both in terms of perpetuating discrimination or ending it.
Yeah, we have a question. This is all kind of political questions. One of the fellow participant, Pavas Manandar, asked these questions. In recent year, there seems to have been concentrated political move to entangle caste, Hinduism, and nationalism in Nepal and India. This is amalgamation of there is a deeply problematic and feeds of each other, especially in particularly society like ours. What do you think the future of this discussion will be?
And Pradip, explain that a little bit more to me, please.
So this is a rise. This is a rise of in India and Nepal. There's a rise of a Hindu nationalist.
Yes, of course, absolutely. Well, I think that's enormously destructive. I mean, whether it's Hindu or any other religious any other foundation, any other religion, to attempt to transform a country from what is a multicultural, multi-faith democracy, supposedly at least a Westminster democracy in India, with free elections, to try to defeat the dignity of people of other faiths, to try to urge people to, in fact, in some respects, even urge people to convert back to Hinduism is just, I think, is wrong-headed. I would even go so far as to say that it's an outrage to modern concepts of democracy and multiculturalism. It is very dangerous in any society for one religion to claim to be such a to claim the national identity of the entire country. I can tell you, India is not alone in this, is it? I mean, I spent a good deal of time over my career in neighboring Sri Lanka, and Sri Lanka went through a 28-year war between a separatist organization that came out of the Tamil community, the so-called Tamil Tigers, and that also, but that movement also, and they were really horrendously violent, and even against their own people who did not support their movement. But that movement also came out of deep discrimination against Tamil people in Sri Lankan history, or at least since independence, I would say more than anything. Today, that is being felt as an anti-Muslim movement, right? I mean, the Buddhist majority of Sri Lanka, like the Buddhist majority of Myanmar, has become kind of a national movement, right? I mean, a movement that says that to be anything but Buddhist in our country is to be a foreigner. I mean, these are people who have lived, the Tamils have lived in Sri Lanka for well over 2,500 years. And that discrimination continues, that marginalization continues. So yes, I think that that if a Hindu nationalist movement um, in India is just anathema to the future of democracy in the country.
We have a few more questions. One of the friend, Kim Biswakarma asks, do you agree that there is a systematic discrimination against non-white? What efforts have been made at government level to end the discrimination?
Well, I think there have been many efforts actually at the national level over many decades. Obviously, the civil rights movement with Martin Luther King and others who headed it had profound influence both in American culture and American society and American democracy, but also passing the Voting Rights Act eventually under Lyndon Johnson and other legislation. So we have a long way to go in the United States. And the current administration in Washington, frankly, in my opinion, has done a lot to try to roll back some of that progress and voting rights and so forth. So this is going to be a very important election that's coming up in November in the United States, of course. But I think that legislation will continue to be needed in the United States to root out, to protect minorities, to protect anybody against discrimination. But again, I think we need to look into and work within our own communities, just as Brandeis has tried to do. Now look, Brandeis, like every other institution, is today also deeply soul-searching in terms of whether there are attitudes within the university, whether they're students or faculty or administration. We are all going through a soul-searching process, which is going on in many other universities also, and in faith traditions around the United States, to finally confront visibly and meaningfully issues of race-based discriminations within our own society.
Earlier in our conversation, you already talked about the Black Lives Matters, but one of the friend asks, Krishnaji asks, to what extent the Black Lives Matter movement will bring change in the American status quo, government policies, institutional policies like yours, and individual consciousness. Though Nepal has made tremendous progress compressed in short period of time, Nepal unfortunately has not seen a real movement as Krishnaji said. Do you want a response on this? Any more?
Right. Well, you know, there have been powerful social movements in the United States history against discrimination. Whether Black Lives Matter is going to achieve be transformational and achieve lasting impact is to be seen, of course. I can't predict the future, but I will say that I think it feels in many respects like it has catalyzed at least a deeper and more overt discussion nationally, right down to local communities and right up to the highest levels of the federal government about race in America. You know, many probably thought, to some extent I did too, that Barack Obama's election was a sea change in America, and it was. It was an enormous, indicative of enormous progress, right? I mean, African Americans did not elect Barack Obama by themselves, right? They are a minority in the United States, I think maybe around 13 or 14% of our population. They were a powerful voting bloc in the United States and still are. But Barack Obama did represent what we hope to be a real sea change. And then, of course, we see, even during his administration, a lot of resistance to him that was probably racial discrimination at its heart, frankly. And Black Lives Matter has taken this now to, I think, a fundamentally new level of raising of consciousness around the United States. You know, I live outside of the Boston area, and in many of the communities in the suburbs, we have people from many races and many cultures, but most of our suburban communities west of Boston are predominantly white. The number of Black Lives Matter signs throughout these communities on lawns is really staggering. It's really encouraging because you know that most of these signs are on people on the lawns of families of white families. This is very important because it's no longer just saying that, oh yes, of course I support this or I'm against that. It's saying very visibly to one's neighbors, to one's community, that no, we understand that this needs to change. This needs to stop now. But cultures change slowly. And it's a struggle that I'm sure will have to go on.
Yeah, we're almost end of the sessions. We have more questions, but do you want to say, especially this conversation, we really thinking to how can we globalize the caste issues, especially the South Asia. This is the issues of South Asia. There, United Nations is not recognized properly, and then international institution not recognized, institution not recognizing very well. So in this context, maybe we have our young fellows here. So how can we? This may be my last questions. Maybe you can add more on this. So how can we really globalize these issues, and then people will start the conversation on this caste questions? Maybe you can take some minutes on this, and then we'll wrap up.
Well, thank
Go
you,
ahead, Professor.
Thank you, Pradip. I think the answer, particularly, I think for young people looking at their own societies, looking at what they hear sometimes in their own families, looking at their schools, looking at their first jobs that they may have as employees, or small businesses that they want to begin, have to think beyond the current state of society, right? They need to challenge their elders. They need to challenge their teachers if they feel that what they are being taught does not reflect the society that they want in their futures. They need to begin to build new structures of employment, meaning that if they begin their own small companies, who are they going to hire, right? Are they going to bring in and perpetuate some of the same discriminations, whether it's caste or religious discriminations or others that older generations have lived with, whether they say they are against it or not, they live with it? These are all very important, that within our own lives, within our own, however limited spheres of influence, that we articulate, we think deeply, we learn about, and we try to build toward a more inclusive society. You young people, I think, can do that.
Do you have any final message?
Just a final message is that I get enormously inspired, Pradip, by groups like yours and by the work that you and your family does and others. And I want to thank again you and Pradika, who took great care of me during the preparation for the meeting. And I hope we will be in contact, and I encourage anybody on this webinar to please be in touch with me. I'd be delighted to continue this conversation offline, if you will, though through email or things. My email address is Simon, SIMON, at Brandeis, BRANDEIS.edu. And if I come to Nepal, I hope someday, after things settle down with the pandemic, I hope to be able to meet many of you there. Thank you, Pradip.
Thank you so much, Professor. We love to welcome you in Nepal very soon. So thank you very much for joining us today. We have come to the end of today's episode of Caste Conversation. On behalf of Dalit Lives Matter Nepal, I want to thank you everyone for your solidarity. A special thank to Professor Laurence Simon. This is an interesting session. I hope our friend enjoyed the session. I'm also thankful to my friend that you already mentioned, the Bridika, Suluchana, Vikas, Vijay, and Prakriti for making this possible. Friends, we will see you next week with another guest to talk about the caste questions in Caste Conversation. This is Pradip Pariyar signing off for today. Namaste, stay safe, stay happy wherever you are, stay safe. This is a very critical time. Thank you for joining. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you. Thank you, everyone.